Bleach was the first big shonen anime I watched as a kid, and because of that, it'll always have a special place in my heart. Up to the point where Aizen first reveals himself and leaves Soul Society, for me it was almost a perfect show. Those first few seasons are just unparalleled, and there are so many amazing scenes I've rewatched countless times. Of all the big three anime at the time, Naruto, Bleach, and One Piece, Bleach was my favourite. But, and it saddens me to say this, I feel like Bleach only really declined after that first Aizen reveal, and it never really managed to recapture what it was that made the early anime so special. There are lots of things that went wrong, but the one I want to focus in on today is how the Espada were horribly wasted. The Espada are such a cool villain group. The only other anime group I can think of who are as iconic and memorable are the Akatsuki in Naruto. Kubo really nailed their designs and personalities, and being hollows, they felt like a natural enemy of the Shinigami, and a natural group of antagonists in the show. They fit naturally into Aizen's plans of mixing Shinigami and Hollow to evolve, and they mirror Ichigo's own personal struggle with his inner Hollow. But for all the build-up and hype they get, they ended up being totally ineffective as a villain group. Their showings are all anticlimactic and lackluster, and in the end, you're just left questioning what was even the point of them, or why did Aizen waste his time forming the group? I think Kubo tried to remedy this somewhat with the 1000-Year Blood War arc, but I really dislike how the Quincy and this whole final arc were handled. It's definitely a topic for another time, why I don't think the Quincy worked, but I maintain to this day that it would have been much better for Kubo to effectively merge these two arcs, doing away with the Quincy altogether and instead making the Espada the threat that the Quincy were, and that they deserved to be. So I'm going to split this video into two parts. In the first part, I'll talk about my general problems with the Espada and how I think they were wasted. And in the second part, we'll go through each of the Espada in turn and talk about them individually. So let's just get to it. General problems. There are two main problems I see with the Espada, and they're very closely tied together. The first is that the Espada just don't feel threatening enough. And the second is that their power levels seem wildly inconsistent when compared to their ranks. So let's talk about the first point. For villains to be effective, there need to be two things. They need to appear as menacing, and then they also need to be actually menacing. They need to provide a realistic threat to the protagonist or the group of protagonists. When the Shinigami first learn about the Arrancar, they are massively hyped up. Remember that at this point in the series, the captains are pretty much the apex of power, and the obstacle that Ichigo had been struggling to overcome while trying to save Rukia. When Ichigo finally learns Bankai, he finally reaches this apex of power. But then, coming off the high of him beating Byakuya in a 1 vs 1, and the setup of the big bad in the form of Aizen, we then see Grimmjow absolutely destroy Ichigo in his first appearance. I know Ichigo was struggling with his inner hollow at this point, but it's still a dramatic, menacing introduction. We especially see the difference in how Ichigo was able to handle Yami fairly easily before his hollow interfered, versus Grimmjow giving him one of the most brutal beatdowns of his entire life. And we see how afraid Rukia is when she meets Grimmjow for the first time. She's totally overwhelmed by his power. And on top of all this, we learn that he is only the number 6 ranked Espada, and that the Espada have another released form that increases their power even more, obviously mirroring a Bankai. And talking of Bankais, we see that Hitsugaya actually has to use his Bankai to defeat a non-Espada opponent. And then we get the panel from him stating that Faster Lorde Hollows are more powerful than Captain Class Shinigami. And his words really have weight to them after we've seen what Grimmjow can do. And it really does feel menacing and scary that Aizen has managed to recruit such a powerful group to directly counter the Gotei 13. I remember thinking at the time, how are the Shinigami going to win? How are they going to contend with such powerful foes? But then, unfortunately, in practice, the Espada as a group end up accomplishing very little. For all their hype, none of them get any significant victories against the Shinigami. They inflict no casualties, and they are practically all beaten in 1 vs 1 fights. It's really funny to see now Aizen stating at the start of the fake Karakura town arc that he would win without needing to do a single thing. The top 3 Espada were the most disappointing of all. Aizen had such faith in them, and in the end they accomplished nothing, and Aizen had to fight the entire Gotei 13 on his own, and he won. How could he have had such laughably poor judgment? What was even the point of wasting so much time recruiting the Espada and forming the group if he ended up just fighting everybody on his own anyway? And then the other problem with the Espada is that they feel really inconsistent. The most threatening two Espada are probably Ulquiorra and Grimmjow, who both present a massive challenge for Ichigo, especially in the case of Ulquiorra, who basically kills Ichigo twice. But I think the dynamic of the Espada suffers a bit from main character syndrome, where the main character is always given the most dramatic and spectacular fights. And so we end up in a weird state where the number 4 and 6 Espada feel the most threatening as a direct result of them fighting against Ichigo, but the higher ranked Espada feel somehow weaker. And I'm especially thinking of the top 3 Espada here, Stark, Barragan, and Haribel. I'll get more into this as we discuss each Espada in turn. So let's now move on to that and go through Espadas 10 to 1 in order from lowest to highest, and I'll discuss my thoughts on each one. I know that Yami is later revealed to be the Zero Espada, but this makes no sense, so I'm just going to keep him here at number 10. I honestly don't have too much to say about Yami. He's overall a pretty boring character and a bit of a joke, to be honest. He has zero backstory and is destroyed by Ichigo in his first appearance, after which he barely does anything of note. I think he's well suited to the rank of 10, being significantly stronger than most characters in the series, as we see him destroy Chad, but a bit of a pushover when it comes to a proper captain level opponent, as we see when Ichigo takes off his arm with zero effort. I see him as being the bridge between regular Arrancar and the more powerful members of the Espada. However, the weird reveal of him being the Zero Espada is just so bad, and it's difficult to put it into words exactly, because it makes so little sense. Even as the Zero Espada, he has an awful showing, getting off-screened by a weakened Kenpachi and Byakuya. His released Zero form actually seems weaker than his base form, since he gets so big and clumsy he can barely find his opponents. And worst of all, the twist reveal doesn't really serve any narrative purpose. It's almost like the thought popped up once in Kubo's brain, and he decided to throw it in there without giving any further thought to it. In short, the manga itself doesn't seem to take him or his fights seriously, and neither should we. Whilst his powers and backstory are pretty uninteresting, I actually really like his presence as the number 9 Espada. It's a nice personal fight for Rukia, tying all the way back into her early memories of her mentor Kaien, and him creepily puppeting the body of Kaien is very fitting of a hollow enemy. I also like that he's shown to be clearly stronger than Rukia, and he does in fact effectively win his fight, before Rukia kills him with a final trick. It's nice to see a fight in Bleach that isn't just one combatant straight up overwhelming another, or the classic Bleach move of one character having a hack that straight up overpowers another character or another character's hack for vaguely explained reasons, and instead seeing somebody win by simply playing a bit dirty and a bit underhandedly and pulling a final trick. I really like Saiyazel. He's the equivalent of Mayuri for the Hollow, and he really fits the image of a mad scientist. Similar to Araniro, I really like his creepy and slightly disgusting motif. Some of his scientific capabilities do feel overpowered and poorly explained, like him being able to disable Renji's Bunkai and make himself immune to Ishida's attacks, but is really no more ridiculous than some of Mayuri's own abilities. And it's nice to see him get some wins against the heroes, even if he doesn't actually kill anybody, instead toying around with them. And speaking of Mayuri, even though I liked the mirror matchup of evil scientists, I don't really like how Mayuri won. The superhuman drug itself is a very cool idea, but it's a classic example of Bleach hacks, an ability that the opponent has no counter for and couldn't anticipate, and is only used once despite it being incredibly powerful and never mentioned again. Zomari is a pretty boring and forgettable Espada. His ability is somewhat interesting, but Byakuya hard counters him in a way that makes the fight less interesting. And since Byakuya shows his ability can be countered using Kido, it should mean that any competent captain level opponent would be able to deal with Zomari. Zomari also has an outrageous claim, which I find hard to believe. that he's the fastest of all the Espada. Despite him using some tricks with Sonido to create clones, he doesn't come across as particularly fast to me, and his resurrection effectively stops him from moving, so I'm really not sure what the point of this was. Can't really see him being faster than other Espada like Grimmjow or Ulquiorra, also considering that Byakuya didn't seem too fazed by his speed, but was completely outclassed by Bunkai Ichigo in their fight. One thing I thought might be kind of interesting was that he seems to love Aizen the most of all the Espada, praising him even at the moment of his death. It's never explored further though, and overall I'd say Zomori is very forgettable, failing even to kill Rukia or accomplish anything else of note. Zomori is actually the only Espada who I think would have been much better suited to a support role rather than a frontline fighter. His ability would actually be pretty devastating if he used it stealthily from out of sight. But anyway, moving on. So we finally arrive at one of the big Espada, and I think it's no surprise that Grimmjow is a fan favourite. His personality is perfect for a villain. He's the first true hollow rival that Ichigo has. He's cocky, he's brash, and he's powerful, and he feels dangerous in almost every appearance he has. I love the scene when his arm is healed by Inoue and he destroys Luffy effortlessly, who, let's be honest, was a pretty lame character. I really like the philosophy represented by Grimmjow as well. His defeat serves as a key lesson for Ichigo, the lesson that his inner hollow was trying to teach him, that to be an effective fighter he needs to surrender to his base fighting instinct and not try to rationalize every fight and clash. The design of his base and resurrection forms is also really fantastic. It really captures his ferocious, savage nature. And I like that he seems to have his own code of honor which he abides by. I mean really, what Bleach fan doesn't like Grimmjow? I don't like Noitara as a person, but I think he's a good character in the Espada. I like his backstory with Nell, and I like how he represents a different kind of personality within the group. Kind of a treacherous, underhanded fighter. A lot of fighters in Bleach seem to follow a sort of unspoken code of honor, where fights are kept 1 versus 1, and generally fighters are pretty straight up, without resorting to tricks or deception. Noitara, however, doesn't care about any of this. He beats Nell by first targeting her weaker Frachion, then teaming up with Saiyazel and tricking her with an illusion. Then, he attacks both Ichigo and Grimmjow after they're weakened from their fight, which is interesting coming off the back of Grimmjow insisting Ichigo be healed to full strength for their own fights. Grimmjow, despite his ferocity and lust for battle, fights fairly. Noitara does not. And as I said, I think he's a bit of a scumbag, but I think he's a good member of the Espada and he brings a unique dynamic to the team. His resurrection, however, I thought was pretty disappointing. Considering he's ranked number 5, the main features of his resurrection seem to be that he becomes more durable and he gets more arms. Arms which Kenpachi is constantly slicing off. I did enjoy their fight as a back and forth slugfest, but the ending I thought was pretty anticlimactic, with Kenpachi simply one-shotting him when he decides to take the fight seriously and use 2 hands. I know it's later revealed that Kenpachi gets stronger with each defeat he suffers, but I still find the power levels here really inconsistent. Ichigo was able to defeat Kenpachi with just his Shikai back in the Soul Society arc, but here Kenpachi seems to be stronger, or at least on par with, a Bunkai and Hollow-fied Ichigo, which really should put him head and shoulders above Kenpachi. But where Ichigo struggled with Grimmjow, who looked far more impressive than Noitara in terms of speed and destructive power, Kenpachi fairly easily handles Noitara. And so we arrive at probably the next biggest Espada next to Grimmjow, Ulquiorra. Ulquiorra ties for my favourite Espada with Grimmjow, and it's funny to think that he's the first Espada we see along with Yami when they first appear in the human world. Ulquiorra is by far the most menacing Espada. Whereas Grimmjow is much more bombastic and unhinged, Ulquiorra is menacing in the sense that he seems totally indifferent to Ichigo during their fights, for the most part, and actually succeeds in killing him twice, which is more than all the other Espada accomplished combined. I also really like his relationship with Inoue. It's very intriguing, and it's a shame he died before it could develop further. It's probably the most interesting personal relationship a Hollow has with another person in the whole series. I love Ulquiorra's design as well. His release is my favorite one, but, and I hate to say it, Ulquiorra really feels too powerful considering he's placed at number 4. We'll get onto the top 3 in just a moment, but Ulquiorra feels far and away the most impressive Espada. He's the only one who feels truly unstoppable. He feels like an absolute force of nature that Ichigo could never hope to overcome. And of course, he is the only Espada who possesses a second release. But Ulquiorra is so powerful that he ends up outclassing the rest of the group. All the top 3 Espada seem to pale in comparison to him, and it's not really clear why Ulquiorra is the only one who possesses a second release, or why he decided to hide it from Aizen, considering how loyal he seems to be. I also hate how he is beaten after being shown to be an untouchable demonic force for the entire fight. Ichigo gets a hollow transformation that has never been seen before and is never seen after this fight, and suddenly ragdolls Ulquiorra. It really feels like Kubo just wanted to write a desperate fight with the characters and audience despairing, but then realized he had no idea how to stop Ulquiorra killing everyone, and so he randomly gave Ichigo a new hollow form. I know it's kind of shown that Ichigo's hollow powers are getting stronger from the time he spends in Hueco but I really dislike how such a monstrously overpowered form just appears from nowhere, conveniently wins the fight for Ichigo, then all goes back to normal, and then it's never referenced again. So all in all, a great character and a great fight, but ruined by poor writing. It would have been better to either tone down Ulquiorra to make it a more reasonable matchup, or make the top 3 Espada even more powerful. So, as we move on to the top 3, I just want to call back to the fact that Aizen had so much faith in them that he told Gin and Tozen that they wouldn't have to lift a finger to fight. And yet, none of the top 3 Espada accomplish anything at all, and Aizen ends up wiping out the Gote 13 single-handedly. I firmly believe that at least the top 3 Espada should have all required multiple captains teaming up at once. Forcing them all into 1 versus 1 duels really diminishes how powerful they're meant to be. Tia Haribel is the most disappointing of an already disappointing top 3. Her personality is fairly bland and forgettable. I do like that she has water powers, which is something pretty rare in Bleach, but her matchup against Hitsugaya is very boring since they mostly go back and forth between water and ice. Her showing is also pretty poor. Hitsugaya is probably one of the weaker captains, but he seems to be able to keep up with her without any problems, and it's unclear if she could have broken free from his ice without help from Wonderweiss. If you compare her to someone like Ulquiorra or even Grimmjow, she seems very lackluster, and she ends up being killed by Aizen almost as an afterthought by Kubo, without even resolving her fight. Baragon has such a cool power set and design. I love his backstory as well, which fleshes out the world of Hueco and what life might be like as a Hollow. The idea that Aizen managed to subdue and recruit the King of the Hollows is a really interesting one, and Baragon, at least on paper, is well deserving of his title. However, he unfortunately again accomplishes nothing. Respira is such an overwhelmingly powerful ability that Baragon should be littering corpses wherever he goes. But unfortunately, he's handicapped by the writing, meandering around the battlefield and going on comedic chase sequences with Omaida, who is already a joke of a character. His death scene is actually pretty good. I think turning his own power on him is a clever way to have him be defeated, and at least it ends up being a sort of team effort to bring him down between Hachi and Soifan. But Baragon really deserved to accomplish more before he died. Respira only claimed 1 victim, Soifan's arm, which is pretty incredible to think that was the extent of what it could do despite being such a powerful ability. The group of people fighting Baragon should really have been expanded out more, and you could lean more into the idea of using his own ability against him by involving someone like Ukitake in the fight as well. If this was the Quincy arc, Baragon would probably have ended up killing at least a few vice captains and probably a few captains on top. So we finally arrive at the number 1 Espada, Stark. Again, I really like Stark as a character. He shows us a different side to the Hollow. He's the only one we see who is actually pretty conflict avoidant, and I really like his backstory where he was shown to be lonely and isolated due to his strength. It's quite moving to see him wandering alone in Huacomondo, and to see that he's grateful to Aizen for gathering him with other strong comrades so he doesn't have to feel alone anymore. But considering he is meant to be the most powerful Espada, he really doesn't feel like he lives up to the hype. He does fight multiple captain class opponents, which is good, but his resurrection just feels really lacking to me. The idea of him firing multiple Zero is interesting, and it's cool to see an Espada with a very different theme in the form of the guns. But unfortunately, we run into a classic problem here, that the first time an ability is used, or when it's used on its own, it appears powerful, but the more it's used, the less effective it becomes. When Ulquiorra and Grimmjow use Zero, it feels pretty impactful and powerful, and Ulquiorra punches a hole right through Ichigo's chest with his Zero. But when Stark fires thousands of Zeros from his pistols, they just don't feel threatening. Multiple characters take hits from them, but none of them suffer as much damage as Ichigo did. And for some reason, for the majority of his fights, he seems incapable of hitting someone with his guns unless they're distracted. It's frustrating to see him constantly firing and missing all his shots, and he can't really do anything about it. Kyoraku was a great opponent for him though, one of the most senior and most powerful captains, and also a tricky and underhanded fighter, a bit like Neutra. His games-based Shikai is another clever way to defeat a more powerful opponent. But it's a shame to see so many captains fighting Stark using their Shikai, and to also see him defeated without facing a Bunkai. The number 1 Espada losing to a Shikai just feels wrong, and he really, above everybody else, should have been able to kill multiple characters before finally being put down. So that takes us to the end of the list. All in all, the Espada were really disappointing and ended up accomplishing nothing as a group. To me, it kind of made the whole Hollow arc feel like a waste of time, since the captains seem to totally outclass the Arrancar, and it ends up reflecting poorly on Aizen, who seems to have just wasted his time gathering the group. Bleach really has a problem with the writing of its fights, especially as the series goes on, and Kubo seems to me like somebody who has lots of great and interesting ideas, but is really poor at executing them in a satisfying and coherent way. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, he possibly seems to have realized by the 1000-Year Blood War arc that the villains need their own wins to feel intimidating, but I really dislike this arc. Again, for reasons I may discuss another time. As for this video, I think this is a good place to wrap up. So, as always guys, thanks for watching. If you want to see a video on the 1000-Year Blood War arc, let me know. And definitely share any thoughts you have in the comments on the Espada, whether you agree with me or disagree. I always do my best to reply to everybody. And if you enjoyed the video and want to see more, please do like and subscribe. Thank you.